Tom Turner had always preferred the simplicity of solitude, especially since his retirement. After years of serving in the military, where every day was filled with orders and discipline, he had grown accustomed to the peace that came with his suburban home. His house, situated on the edge of town, was modest, just a single-story structure nestled between towering oak trees and bordered by a row of hedges that separated his yard from the neighborhood's main street. It wasn't a mansion, nor was it extravagant by any stretch of the imagination, but to Tom, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could reflect on his past and find some semblance of peace. It wasn't the house itself that mattered, but the memories it held, the quiet, unspoken connection to the years he had spent serving his country, far away from the comforts of home. Memorial Day had always been special to Tom. Every year, without fail, he made sure to watch the Veterans Memorial broadcast, a ritual that had become a part of his life ever since he lost so many comrades during his time in the service. The broadcast brought him back to the days when he was younger, when life was full of purpose and camaraderie. It was a time for him to honor his fallen brothers and reflect on the sacrifices made in the name of freedom. It was the one occasion where Tom allowed himself to feel the weight of the past without burying it completely. Each year, as the national anthem played and the faces of soldiers, both living and deceased, appeared on the screen, Tom could feel the raw emotion rise up in him. It was catharsis, a quiet acknowledgement that the pain would never truly fade, but that it could be acknowledged and respected. This year, however, things went differently. The day began like any other, with Tom sitting down in his favorite armchair in the living room, a cup of coffee in hand and the television tuned to the familiar station. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors as he settled in for the broadcast. It was an annual ritual that helped him feel connected to the world beyond his quiet neighborhood, a world where people understood what it meant to sacrifice for a cause. But as the broadcast started, just as the names of the fallen began to scroll across the screen, something unexpected happened. The television screen flickered once, then went black. Tom frowned, clicking the remote control, thinking it was a glitch. A quick glance at the cable box revealed no signal. "What the hell?" he muttered, getting up from his seat and walking over to the window to check if perhaps there was an issue with the dish outside. His backyard, where he had installed the satellite dish years ago, was undisturbed, the long grass swaying gently in the breeze. He stepped outside and looked up at the dish, only to see that the cables had been cut clean through. Who would do this? He asked himself, a sense of growing unease settling in his stomach. He had always taken great care of his property, never bothering anyone. As far as he knew, the neighbors respected his privacy. But now, someone had interfered with the one connection he had to the outside world. Someone had intentionally severed his access to the very broadcast that meant so much to him. The feeling of violation was immediate and jarring, but it was also something deeper, a feeling that someone, somewhere, was challenging his autonomy. Without thinking, Tom grabbed his phone and called his satellite service provider. He didn't expect them to be much help, but he had to try. A customer service representative answered after a few minutes, and Tom explained the situation. "We've detected a signal cut in your area," the representative said. "It seems like the service was intentionally interrupted. Let me pull up the details for you." Tom waited impatiently as the representative checked the system. "It appears that the HOA approved an action to disable your satellite service," the voice on the other end said, confirming what Tom already feared. "The HOA," Tom repeated, dumbfounded. "Why would they do that?" "I'm afraid I don't have that information, sir. but it seems they cited your property as being in violation of certain regulations. They requested the disconnection, and we followed through." Tom's blood ran cold. The HOA. He had no idea that his property was under their jurisdiction. He had never signed anything, never agreed to any rules or fees. But it made sense. He had heard rumors from neighbors about the HOA becoming more aggressive in enforcing their so-called rules. But this was a step too far. Whoever had made this decision was not just crossing a line. They were erasing part of Tom's life, his connection to something that had helped him process years of service, loss, and grief. The broadcast was his annual moment of remembrance, a private ritual that allowed him to honor the fallen. Tom's next move was clear. He would confront the HOA. He had to find out who authorized this and why. He couldn't just let it slide. But there was a deeper feeling inside him, a sense that the HOA was now trying to take something from him that wasn't theirs to take. The neighborhood had always felt like home, but now it felt as though there were invisible forces at play, forces that were more interested in controlling his life than respecting his privacy. The HOA office was located in a nondescript building a few blocks away. Tom had never had any reason to visit it before, and, frankly, he wasn't sure what to expect. But today, his blood boiled, and he was determined to get answers. He drove to the office, the anger and frustration building with every passing minute. As he approached the building, his eyes scanned the parking lot for any sign of the person responsible for the satellite disruption. He didn't expect much, but he had to start somewhere. Inside the office, Tom was greeted by a receptionist, a woman who seemed completely uninterested in his concerns. She directed him to the office of Marla Davis, the HOA president, a woman who had a reputation for being ruthless in her dealings with homeowners. Tom had heard whispers about her, how she could make or break a homeowner's standing with the HOA with the flick of a pen. Marla Davis was sitting behind a polished desk when Tom walked in. She gave him a practiced smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice smooth, "how can I help you today?" Tom didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I want to know why you had my satellite service cut off. I was watching the Veterans Memorial broadcast when it happened." Marla tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Ah, yes. I believe that's because your satellite dish violates several of our community standards. We've made multiple attempts to notify you about this." Tom's blood pressure spiked. "You never contacted me about any violations." "Well, the notices were sent to your address," Marla said, her tone dismissive. "We're within our rights to ensure all properties comply with the standards set forth for the neighborhood." "I never signed anything agreeing to those standards," Tom shot back. "I never joined your association. My property is my own." Marla's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, the mask slipped a little. "You're mistaken, Mr. Turner. All properties in this neighborhood are automatically subject to the rules of the association. Your satellite dish is an eyesore and doesn't meet the guidelines. It's been reported, and we've had to act on it." Tom felt the weight of her words, and in that moment he realized that this wasn't just about a satellite dish. This was about control, about a group of people with the power to dictate how he lived his life. He had been silent for too long, kept to himself, avoided the politics of the neighborhood. But now, he was being dragged into it, unwillingly. "You've made a mistake," Tom said quietly, standing up, "and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Tom Turner spent the next few days stewing in frustration. The disruption of his Memorial Day broadcast had been the tipping point. What started as a simple issue with a satellite dish was now something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. He was a man who valued his privacy and his routines, and for years his suburban home had provided him with the quiet solitude he craved. The house, though small, was his refuge. It wasn't just about the physical space. It was about the memories attached to it, the way it represented a life after the military that he had carefully built. His relationship with the house was one of deep connection, and it symbolized a life he fought for. Now, someone had trampled all over that connection, and that someone was a group of faceless bureaucrats who seemed to think they could control every aspect of his life. The more Tom thought about it, the angrier he became. The HOA, an organization he had never willingly signed up for, was now dictating what he could and could not do on his property. Tom had always steered clear of the politics of the neighborhood, preferring to keep to himself and avoid any unnecessary conflict. But this wasn't something he could just let slide. He had spent years avoiding confrontation, but now he felt like he had no choice. The small act of defiance, the severing of his satellite cable, had awakened something in him. He had always been a fighter, but fighting was something he had done for others, for a cause. This time, he was fighting for himself. Tom knew that the best way to proceed was through legal means, but he wasn't naive enough to believe that the HOA would be reasonable. He had read about the tactics they used to bully homeowners, how they would find the smallest infractions to fine people and drive them into submission. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that this was no random act. The HOA had orchestrated this move against him deliberately. He was a target, and it wasn't about the satellite dish. The HOA had probably been looking for an excuse to go after him for months, waiting for the right opportunity. The satellite dish was just the excuse they needed. So, Tom decided to take action. He wasn't the kind of man to back down when something didn't feel right. His military training had taught him to stand firm in the face of adversity, to gather his resources, and to strike with precision. But he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone who understood the intricacies of property law, someone who could guide him through the legal maze that the HOA had built around him. That's when he thought of Richard Stone, an old friend and lawyer who had helped him with some minor issues in the past. Richard had been a trusted confidant during Tom's service days, a man who understood how to navigate complicated systems, and, most importantly, a man who knew how to fight back against bullies. Tom called Richard, his hands gripping the phone tightly as he explained the situation. Richard listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions before responding with calm assurance. "This is exactly the kind of thing I've been dealing with for years," Richard said. "The HOA has been flexing its muscles in ways that are not only unethical, but likely illegal. I'm going to need to dig into their records to see exactly what they've been doing, but we can definitely push back. I'll take the first step and get in touch with them." The conversation ended with Richard promising to get back to Tom with more information as soon as possible. But in the meantime, Tom's thoughts were consumed by the growing realization that this wasn't just about his satellite dish anymore. It was about his autonomy, his right to live his life the way he saw fit, without interference from a group of people who were more interested in exercising power than in fairness. The more he thought about the HOA's tactics, the more Tom began to see a pattern emerging. They had been targeting him from the start, probably because he had been one of the few residents who didn't participate in their meetings or pay their dues. The next few days were a blur of research and phone calls. Tom spent hours digging through old files and browsing through the documents he had been sent by the HOA over the years. They had sent him several notices about minor issues with his property, things that Tom had always brushed aside as petty requests. He had never paid much attention to them, thinking they were just part of the usual HOA bureaucracy that everyone else dealt with. But now, looking at those notices in a new light, Tom realized that the HOA had been systematically building a case against him. They had sent him warnings for everything from the placement of his mailbox to the color of the paint on his front door. They had a record of every minor infraction, and they had been using that record to compile a dossier on him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Richard called a few days later, his voice low and serious. "I've done some digging, and I've got bad news, Tom. The HOA is well within their rights to ask for the removal of your satellite dish. Unfortunately, when you bought the house, you agreed to their regulations, even if you didn't realize it. The neighborhood's rules are more than just guidelines. They're legally binding. But that doesn't mean we can't fight back. We'll start by challenging their authority over the satellite dish, and if that doesn't work, we'll look at the bigger picture. There are some serious questions about their practices that could open the door for a bigger case." Tom felt his stomach drop as the reality of the situation set in. He had never agreed to anything with the HOA. He had never been presented with the documents or asked to sign any contracts. He had simply moved in, and now it seemed that his ignorance of the rules was being used against him. He wasn't just fighting over a satellite dish, he was fighting against an entire system that had been operating in the shadows, quietly imposing rules and regulations on homeowners without their knowledge or consent. He had unknowingly walked into a trap. But Tom wasn't one to give up easily. He had faced down much bigger enemies in his life, and he wasn't about to let a group of bureaucrats take his home from him. As he sat in his living room, staring out at the quiet suburban street that he had once felt so comfortable in, a wave of determination washed over him. This wasn't just about a satellite dish anymore. This was about fighting for his right to live on his own terms, to be left alone without fear of constant surveillance and harassment from a group of people who thought they had the right to control every aspect of his life. The next step in Tom's plan was clear. He would take legal action, but he would also need to get the community on his side. He knew that the HOA had been using its power to manipulate other residents, pressuring them into compliance by threatening them with fines and legal action. But Tom had learned something from his time in the military. People were stronger when they stood together. If he could rally his neighbors, if he could show them that they weren't alone, then maybe, just maybe, they could put an end to the HOA's reign of terror. Tom began to reach out to his neighbors, cautiously at first, to see if they had ever faced similar issues with the HOA. To his surprise, many of them were willing to talk. Some were hesitant, afraid of the repercussions, but others were eager to share their stories of intimidation and harassment. Tom was beginning to see a pattern emerge. The HOA wasn't just targeting him, it was targeting everyone who didn't conform to their idea of what the neighborhood should look like. And Tom realized that if he could expose the HOA for what it was, an oppressive, corrupt organization, then he might stand a chance at dismantling it once and for all. With this new determination, Tom set his sights on the next step, confronting the HOA head-on. He had the evidence, he had the support of his neighbors, and he had the resolve to see this through to the end. The battle was just beginning, but Tom was ready to fight. After all, he had faced worse odds before, and he wasn't about to let a group of petty bureaucrats stand in the way of his peace. The fight for his home, his autonomy, and his right to live a quiet life was far from over, and Tom was determined to win. Tom Turner's frustration reached a boiling point over the next few weeks. His initial shock had evolved into a quiet but determined resolve. The days seemed to drag on as he waited for the HOA's next move, But he wasn't the type to let things sit idly by. As the situation worsened, he began to question the very foundations of his existence in the quiet suburban neighborhood he had once considered a haven. The house he had worked so hard for, the place that had given him peace after years of military service, now felt like a battleground. Tom had always believed that he could retreat into the background of life, enjoy his home, and live without conflict. But now, conflict had come to his doorstep in a way that left him no room to hide. Richard Stone, his lawyer and old friend, had advised him to start gathering more information before proceeding with any legal action. Richard had been a steady presence, offering Tom the reassurance that they could fight back against the HOA. However, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that each day without action made him more vulnerable. The satellite dish was just the beginning, but it was clear that the HOA was methodically building a case against him, digging in their heels as though they had all the time in the world to erode his life bit by bit. Tom knew that to win this battle, he needed to take control of the situation before it escalated further. After a few sleepless nights spent thinking about the next steps, Tom decided to make a more direct move. He couldn't let this slide any longer. The phone calls to Richard had become more frequent as the tension in his chest mounted. The more Tom researched the HOA, the more he discovered about its unchecked power. It wasn't just a group enforcing simple neighborhood rules. It was a massive, well-oiled machine that used its authority to prey on homeowners, making money off petty fines and threatening legal action against those who dared to stand up. Their system was built on intimidation, and it worked for the most part. But Tom was different. He wasn't easily intimidated, and the more they tried to push him down, the more determined he became. Richard had suggested taking a more measured approach, sending a formal letter demanding the restoration of Tom's satellite connection, backed by legal grounds that the HOA had no right to interfere in such matters. The problem, however, was that the HOA had their own legal team, and Tom knew that sending a letter wouldn't be enough. This would be a long, drawn-out process, full of loopholes, stalling tactics, and endless delays. If Tom were to wait for that process to unfold, he would lose. He knew it deep down. The HOA was built for bureaucratic warfare, while he was just a man trying to protect what he had left. This was a battle of endurance, but it wasn't one he could afford to lose. As the frustration mounted, so did the sense of helplessness that gripped him. Tom had already been forced to accept a certain level of intrusion into his life, but this time was different. He couldn't let it happen again. Tom decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew that the HOA wasn't just targeting him for a satellite dish. This was a systematic attempt to force him into submission, to make him feel small and powerless in the face of their overreaching authority. He was beginning to see through their tactics, and it wasn't just about the satellite. It was about undermining his sense of autonomy, about making him feel like a guest in his own home. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about the satellite. This was about the principle of living free from harassment, free from the suffocating grip of an organization that saw everyone as a number, as a source of revenue. Tom's first move was simple. He began reaching out to his neighbors. Over the years, he had kept to himself, not getting involved in neighborhood politics or HOA meetings. The few neighbors he spoke with were cordial, but he had never made any real connections. But now, with everything on the line, he had to know if anyone else had faced similar harassment. At first, his neighbors were hesitant to talk, many of them too afraid to speak out against the HOA, fearing retaliation. Some of them had already been fined or threatened with legal action for minor infractions. Others had quietly complied with whatever the HOA demanded, not wanting to rock the boat. But as Tom began to share his frustrations, a few neighbors started to open up. To his surprise, several of them had been targeted for small violations. Grass growing a little too high, trash cans being left out too long, or paint that had faded on their fences. These seemingly trivial matters had led to fines, escalating pressure, and threats of legal action. The HOA had created a climate of fear in the neighborhood, and many of his neighbors were too terrified to stand up to them. It wasn't just the satellite dish. Tom realized that the HOA had been systematically collecting complaints about everyone, using vague bylaws to justify their intrusion into people's lives. The more he heard, the angrier he became. It was clear that the HOA was using its power to control every aspect of life in the neighborhood, from how the lawns were maintained to what color the houses could be painted. The HOA had made homeowners feel powerless, forcing them to comply with every rule, no matter how petty or arbitrary. But Tom wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to roll over. He wasn't going to let the HOA trample on his rights, not without a fight. As he heard more stories from his neighbors, his resolve only strengthened. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. If the HOA thought they could push him around, they had another thing coming. Tom knew that to win, he needed to expose the HOA's tactics, to shine a light on their underhanded practices. But he also knew that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. The HOA was deeply entrenched in the fabric of the neighborhood, and they had the power to drag out legal battles for years. But Tom wasn't afraid of a fight. He had been in much tougher situations before. This time, however, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about standing up for what was right, about showing his neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. The first step in his plan was to go after the satellite dish issue head-on. He called Richard again, this time with more determination in his voice. "I'm not waiting around for them to drag this out," Tom said. "I'm taking action now. They've pushed me too far." Richard, though still cautious, agreed to help. They decided to file an official complaint against the HOA, citing the unlawful interference with Tom's property and demanding that the satellite service be restored immediately. Tom was ready to go to court if necessary, but he also knew that the HOA had resources that far outweighed his own. They could drag out the process, wear him down with legal fees, and force him into a corner. But Tom wasn't going to let that happen. He was prepared to go the distance, even if it meant putting everything on the line. But the escalation came sooner than he expected. One morning, as Tom was preparing for his next step, he discovered that his car had been keyed. The deep gouges in the paint were unmistakable, and the sheer malice behind the act made his blood run cold. Someone had deliberately damaged his property, and Tom knew who was behind it. The HOA wasn't just targeting his satellite dish, they were now targeting him personally. His first instinct was to confront the HOA head-on, but Tom knew that doing so would only escalate things further. Instead, he filed a police report and took photographs of the damage. He was documenting everything now, gathering evidence for the eventual legal battle that he knew was coming. But as he stood outside his car, looking at the scratches that marred its surface, Tom realized that this wasn't just about a satellite dish anymore. This was about something much bigger. The HOA had made it personal, and now there would be no turning back. Tom's anger had turned into something more than just frustration. It had become a driving force. The satellite dish, the car vandalism, and the constant barrage of passive-aggressive emails from the HOA, these weren't just isolated events anymore. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, a larger system of control that the HOA had established to maintain power over the residents. What had once been a minor inconvenience was now a full-blown assault on his right to live his life without interference. And that realization hit Tom like a brick. He wasn't just fighting for his property or his satellite service anymore. He was fighting to preserve the autonomy that had always been his, something he had fought for and earned during his time in the military. The feeling of being boxed in by forces he couldn't see, forces that seemed to have no regard for personal freedom, made him feel cornered in a way he had never experienced before. It was as if the walls of his quiet life were closing in on him, suffocating his every move. Tom's lawyer, Richard, had advised him to keep a low profile, to continue gathering evidence, and to avoid confrontation with the HOA directly. But Tom was no longer interested in taking the slow and careful approach that Richard had outlined. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that inaction would only feed into the HOA's strategy of wear and tear. They had designed a system where homeowners were constantly on edge, always worrying about fines, about violating some obscure rule, and about losing their homes. The fear of constant scrutiny made many residents compliant, but Tom wasn't built that way. He had spent too many years in difficult situations where you had to act quickly and decisively, and now it felt like the time for subtlety was over. If he was going to fight this, he needed to go on the offensive, to expose the HOA for what it really was, a bureaucratic machine designed to manipulate and control, to squeeze every penny from people too afraid to stand up for themselves. It was late one evening when Tom received the first real breakthrough. He had been digging through public records for weeks, looking for any evidence that the HOA had overstepped their boundaries, any information that would give him an advantage. The first documents he came across were innocuous at first, a few bylaws here, a set of old meeting minutes there, but as he dug deeper, something caught his eye. It was a report from a local real estate firm, detailing a series of property sales that had occurred under suspicious circumstances. According to the report, several homes in the neighborhood, including Tom's own, had been sold or foreclosed upon under extremely questionable conditions. The properties were being bought by anonymous investors, and the report suggested that the HOA was in some way involved, either directly or indirectly, in pushing these sales forward. This wasn't just a group of people trying to enforce neighborhood rules. It was a money-making operation, a system designed to control property values and funnel them into the hands of a few powerful individuals. Tom knew this was the ammunition he needed. He reached out to Richard immediately, telling him what he had discovered. Richard, ever the cautious lawyer, was skeptical at first. "You need to be careful," Richard warned. "This could get messy, Tom. If you're right, then we're dealing with something much bigger than a simple HOA dispute. We could be looking at fraud, conspiracy, maybe even collusion with local real estate firms. But we need more proof before we move forward with anything." Tom agreed to proceed carefully, but he knew that the more evidence he gathered, the more he could push back against the HOA. As he continued to sift through public records, his suspicions only deepened. There were multiple instances where homeowners had been coerced into selling their properties at below-market rates, their homes essentially stolen from them by the very people who were supposed to be protecting their interests. The HOA was using its influence to ensure that only certain people, usually wealthy investors, could afford to buy these homes, and they were doing so under the guise of community improvement and aesthetic standards. Tom had uncovered the real game, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. But it wasn't just about the documents. The more Tom spoke to his neighbors, the more he realized that they too had been manipulated by the HOA. They had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid to rock the boat. Some of them had already given up, resigned to the idea that the HOA was an unmovable force, and they just had to endure it. Others were still too intimidated to do anything about it, too afraid that any act of resistance would lead to fines or even the loss of their homes. But as Tom shared what he had discovered, something in the air seemed to shift. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and the more he talked about the HOA's real motivations, the more people began to listen. They were tired of living under the constant threat of fines and harassment. They were tired of feeling like prisoners in their own homes. Tom wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of them. The next step was clear. Tom needed to expose the HOA's practices. He couldn't just rely on legal action alone. He needed to get the public involved, to show everyone what the HOA was really doing behind closed doors. But there was a problem. Tom wasn't exactly a media-savvy person. He didn't have the connections or the experience to make his case known on a larger scale. That's when Richard suggested reaching out to Allison Parker, an investigative journalist who had a reputation for uncovering corruption in local government. Tom was hesitant at first. He didn't want to drag his neighbors into a public spectacle, especially since so many of them were still afraid of the HOA's retaliation. But Richard convinced him that the only way to truly fight back was to make the HOA's practices public. If the story was big enough, it could bring the HOA down for good. Allison Parker agreed to meet with Tom, and after a lengthy conversation she became convinced that the HOA was guilty of much more than just petty harassment. Tom showed her the documents he had uncovered, as well as the testimonies from his neighbors who had been affected by the HOA's tactics. Allison, with her sharp instincts and nose for a story, saw the potential for a big exposé. She promised to look into it further, but it would take time. In the meantime, Tom knew he had to keep pushing forward. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but he wasn't about to wait for someone else to fight his battle for him. He had already seen too much to just sit back and let the HOA continue its reign of terror. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, interviews, and digging through more records. Tom was working harder than he ever had in his life, and the pressure was starting to take its toll. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought about the veterans he had lost, about the people who had made the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. They hadn't given up when things got tough. They had fought to the very end. And if they could do that, so could he. But the final push came when Marla Davis, the HOA president, made a crucial mistake. She didn't know that Tom was one step ahead, but when she sent another letter demanding that Tom remove the satellite dish, again, he knew he had her. She had revealed her true colors once again, showing that the HOA wasn't about community or fairness. It was about control. Tom and Richard had everything they needed now. The documents, the testimonies, the proof of the HOA's illegal practices. It was all there. With the evidence in hand, they were ready. The next move would be to take the fight public. The war was far from over, but Tom had finally found the leverage he needed to break free from the HOA's grip. The days following Tom's discovery of the HOA's tactics felt like a whirlwind. What had begun as a personal dispute over a satellite dish had rapidly spiraled into a fight that involved much more than just him. The fight had become one for his neighborhood, his neighbors' homes, and, ultimately, the freedom to live without fear of constant, arbitrary control. But with every step forward he took, every piece of evidence he uncovered, the resistance he met grew more formidable. The HOA, despite its outward appearance of being a community-enforcing body, was quickly revealing itself as an intricate web of corruption, manipulation, and power. And the more Tom unearthed, the more dangerous it seemed to challenge them head-on. As he entered the second phase of his fight, everything he had worked toward was about to reach a breaking point. At the heart of it all was Marla Davis, the president of the HOA, and she wasn't going to back down without a fight. Tom knew that she was no ordinary bureaucrat. She was a shrewd, calculating woman who had her hands in far more than just the HOA's activities. As Tom's investigation had unfolded, he learned that Marla had ties to several prominent real estate developers who had been snapping up homes in the neighborhood for years, often at bargain prices. These developers had made significant profits by flipping homes that had been encouraged to sell under the HOA's policies, pushing many homeowners into tight financial corners with threats of foreclosure, hefty fines, and other punitive measures. Marla was at the center of this operation, helping orchestrate it all, and Tom had unknowingly become a thorn in her side. When Allison Parker, the investigative journalist, began delving into the story, the tension in the air thickened. She had promised Tom that she would uncover the truth and expose the HOA's criminal activities. But Tom knew that the fight would be long, and he wasn't naive enough to think that exposing the corruption would be an easy task. The HOA had already shown that they were capable of manipulating the system, bending the law to their advantage, and Marla was no stranger to pulling strings behind the scenes. It was becoming evident that any attempt to confront them would likely come with backlash, something far beyond the petty retaliation he had already endured. Tom understood that he was playing a dangerous game. The deeper he got into this fight, the more he stood to lose, not just his peace of mind, but potentially his home, his savings, and his future. But this battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been bullied by this system, about showing his neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear of the HOA's iron fist. The second escalation came when the HOA retaliated in a way that Tom had been expecting, but not to the extent he had feared. One morning, as Tom was sipping his coffee, preparing to go through more legal paperwork and meet with Richard, a letter arrived marked in bold red letters, "Final Notice." Tom tore it open, his eyes scanning the words quickly. The HOA was demanding that he remove the satellite dish under threat of further legal action, including fines that could escalate to an amount so high that it might force him to sell his property. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The letter went on to mention that the HOA was now involving a third party to handle the legal proceedings. Their legal team had grown more aggressive, and they had now enlisted a law firm with a reputation for making quick work of troublesome residents. The letter also mentioned a clause about imminent foreclosure should the situation not be resolved in a timely manner. Tom read the words over and over again, his grip tightening on the paper. They weren't just threatening fines anymore. They were actively pushing him toward losing everything. They had gone beyond intimidation. This was a calculated attempt to force him out, to break his spirit and his resolve. Tom wasn't surprised by the escalation, but the realization that the HOA was willing to take it this far, to go to such extreme lengths, made his blood run cold. They had crossed a line, and now they were willing to destroy his life just to make an example of him. He immediately called Richard, who, after listening to the details of the letter, let out a long, low sigh. "They're pulling out all the stops now," Richard said. "This is more than just about the satellite dish. They're trying to push you to the breaking point. They know you're a veteran, and they know they can exploit that. They think you'll back down when the pressure gets to be too much, but we're not going to let that happen." Richard's words were calm, but Tom could sense the gravity in his voice. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about a fight for his home. It was about a battle for justice, and the odds were stacked against him. The HOA had deep pockets and powerful allies. They could drag things out for years if they wanted to, and they weren't above using underhanded tactics to get what they wanted. The first thing Richard did was file an injunction to halt the foreclosure proceedings and to stop the fines from accumulating. Tom's legal team began preparing the case, gathering evidence to support their claims of harassment, intimidation, and unlawful interference with Tom's property rights. But this wasn't enough. Tom had to do more. He knew that legal battles could take months, even years, and time was one thing he didn't have. The pressure was mounting, and the emotional toll was starting to take its toll on him. He was losing sleep, his appetite was waning, and the constant stress weighed heavily on his shoulders. But he had made a promise to himself, to his fallen comrades, that he wouldn't back down. He had to keep fighting, not just for his home, but for his dignity, for his right to live in peace. It was around this time that the real power of the HOA became apparent. Tom started hearing rumors from more of his neighbors, stories about how the HOA had manipulated the real estate market in the area, driving down property values, pressuring homeowners into selling, and leveraging their authority to enforce deals that benefited the very developers they were supposed to be protecting the community from. Some neighbors whispered about how Marla Davis and her allies had been making under-the-table deals with developers, skimming off profits from the sales of homes and using their control over the HOA to keep the neighborhood in a constant state of flux. The more Tom heard, the more disgusted he became. It wasn't just a few petty fines or legal threats. The HOA was a machine, a network of corruption that had its claws deeply embedded in the community. And Tom wasn't just a victim. He was a part of something much larger, something that could potentially bring down the entire system if exposed. Tom knew the story had to be told. He couldn't just rely on legal action anymore. The public needed to know what the HOA was doing, and he wasn't going to wait for the courts to drag their feet. With Allison Parker's help, Tom decided to go public with the information he had gathered. The exposé that Allison would write wasn't just about Tom's fight. It was about the entire neighborhood, about the systemic corruption that had been festering for years. It was a risky move. The HOA had its own powerful network, and they would stop at nothing to silence anyone who spoke out. But Tom was ready. He had no other choice. They met again with Allison, this time to provide her with the final pieces of the puzzle. The documents, the testimonies, the phone calls with developers, all of it was carefully laid out, ready to be shared with the world. Tom could feel the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about a lawsuit or legal victory. It was about exposing a rot that had infected the community at its core. Allison promised to work quickly, but Tom knew the risks. The HOA would fight back, and they would fight dirty. But as the days passed, Tom found himself standing at a crossroads. He had two choices. He could continue to fight through the legal channels, slowly wearing down the HOA with evidence and courtroom strategy, or he could go all in, expose them to the world, and risk everything. He had already come too far to turn back now. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let them destroy his life, his home, and everything he had worked for. As the date for the exposé drew closer, Tom received another warning, this time in the form of a letter from a law firm that the HOA had hired to handle its cases. The letter was threatening and filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate. But Tom wasn't afraid. The fight had reached a new level, and he was prepared to take it to the finish. The battle had become a fight for truth, for the people who had been too afraid to stand up for themselves, for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of the HOA's power. This was more than just about his house. It was about reclaiming the community from the hands of a few corrupt individuals who thought they could control everyone. Tom was ready to take that fight to the next stage. As the days grew shorter and the pressure mounted, Tom Turner felt himself reaching the point of no return. He had always been a man who sought peace and quiet, a man who found solace in the small, mundane moments of life. But this fight had become something far greater than he had ever imagined. What had started as an annoyance over a satellite dish had quickly turned into a battle for his home, his livelihood, and his dignity. The HOA, an organization that had once seemed like just another part of suburban life, was now the enemy. An enemy that was relentless, calculating, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain its stranglehold over the neighborhood. Tom had spent months gathering evidence, rallying his neighbors, and preparing for the inevitable showdown. His lawyer, Richard, had warned him that the fight would be long and drawn out, but Tom wasn't prepared to simply wait for the wheels of justice to turn. He had already seen how the HOA operated, how they used their power to intimidate and manipulate. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that this wasn't just about one man and his property. It was about a corrupt system that was exploiting the entire community, using its influence to line the pockets of developers and powerful investors. Tom wasn't just fighting for his satellite dish anymore. He was fighting for the future of the neighborhood, for the rights of his fellow residents who had been silently suffering under the HOA's oppressive rule. The turning point came when the exposé, written by the investigative journalist Allison Parker, was finally published. The article, which had been in the works for weeks, laid bare the depths of the HOA's corruption. It detailed how the organization had systematically driven down property values, coerced homeowners into selling their properties at a loss, and funneled the proceeds into the hands of developers with whom they had secretive, lucrative deals. The article painted a picture of a powerful, faceless bureaucracy that thrived on the suffering of ordinary people. It was a story that needed to be told, and it was a story that would change everything. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. For the first time, the community saw the HOA for what it truly was, a corrupt, profit-driven organization that had been using its power to exploit homeowners and manipulate the local real estate market for years. As the story spread, Tom felt a surge of both relief and fear. Relief, because the truth was finally out in the open. Fear, because he knew that exposing the HOA was just the beginning. Marla Davis, the HOA president, wasn't going to take this lying down. If anything, she would come at him harder, more aggressively than ever before. He knew that this fight was far from over, and that the consequences of challenging the HOA could be severe. But Tom wasn't the type to back down. He had been pushed to the edge, and now he had no choice but to see this through to the end. As the media frenzy surrounding the exposé reached its peak, the HOA responded in the only way they knew how, with a full-scale counterattack. Marla Davis, ever the calculating strategist, issued a public statement condemning the article as false and inflammatory, accusing Tom and Allison Parker of attempting to undermine the stability of the community. She insisted that the HOA was simply fulfilling its duty to enforce community standards and protect property values, and that the allegations of corruption were baseless and defamatory. The HOA's legal team threatened to sue Tom, Allison, and the local media outlets that had picked up the story, accusing them of libel and defamation. They filed lawsuits, sent cease and desist orders, and issued threats of criminal charges. It was a classic case of the powerful pushing back against the truth in an attempt to silence their critics. But Tom wasn't intimidated. He had seen this kind of strategy before during his time in the military. It was the same playbook used by those in power when they were backed into a corner: deny, deflect, and discredit. But Tom wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been taken advantage of by the HOA. His neighbors, his community. They all deserved better than to live under the thumb of an organization that cared more about making money than about protecting the people it was supposed to serve. So, Tom stood firm. He refused to be intimidated. He refused to back down. It was at this moment, as the media storm raged on and the HOA's attempts to discredit him grew more vicious, that Tom realized just how far he had come. He had started this journey as a quiet, retired soldier, minding his own business. But now he was at the center of a battle that could change the entire neighborhood. He was no longer just fighting for his own home. He was fighting for the future of every resident in the community who had ever felt the weight of the HOA's oppressive rules. He had become the face of resistance, the symbol of what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. Tom knew that the legal battle was far from over. The HOA had money, power, and connections, and they would use all of it to crush him if they could. But he also knew that the public had turned against them. The expose had given people the courage to speak out, to challenge the HOA's authority, and to demand change. And while Tom couldn't predict what would happen next, he knew that he had already won something important. He had shown the world the truth. He had shown his neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear anymore, that they could fight back against the corruption that had taken root in their community. And that, in itself, was a victory. As the legal proceedings continued, Tom received a call from Richard, his lawyer. The news was both good and bad. The good news was that the courts had agreed to hear his case, and the media attention had put enough pressure on the HOA that they were now forced to respond. The bad news was that the HOA was now using every tactic at their disposal to delay the process. They filed counterclaims, pushed for extended hearings, and did everything they could to stretch the legal battle out. It was clear that they were trying to wear Tom down, to break his resolve by making the fight as long and expensive as possible. But Tom wasn't giving up. He knew that this was going to be a long fight, but he was prepared for it. He had already come so far, and he wasn't about to stop now. The turning point came when a whistleblower from within the HOA's ranks came forward with explosive new information. This whistleblower, a former employee who had worked closely with Marla Davis, revealed that the HOA's corruption went even deeper than anyone had imagined. The employee provided documents that showed how the HOA had colluded with developers to illegally acquire properties, how they had pressured homeowners into selling their homes under threat of foreclosure, and how they had used their influence to manipulate local government officials. This was the smoking gun that Tom and his legal team had been waiting for. It was the evidence they needed to bring the entire operation crashing down. With the new evidence in hand, Tom's legal team filed a motion to have the HOA's activities investigated by the authorities. This move sent shockwaves through the community, as the full extent of the HOA's corruption was now exposed for all to see. Marla Davis and her associates were now facing criminal charges, and the HOA was under investigation for racketeering, fraud, and abuse of power. It was a victory that Tom had worked tirelessly to achieve, but it wasn't over yet. The battle was far from won, but it had shifted in his favor. The momentum was on his side, and he wasn't about to stop until justice was served. As the legal proceedings unfolded, Tom's victory became a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together and fought for what was right. His neighborhood, once divided by fear and intimidation, began to unite in the face of a common enemy. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to join the fight, offering their own testimony and support. And while Tom knew that the road ahead would still be long and difficult, he also knew that he had already won something far more important than any legal victory. He had given his community the courage to stand up and demand better. The battle for his home, his rights, and his neighborhood was far from over. But Tom Turner had proven that one person, standing up for what was right, could make a difference. And that difference was enough to begin unraveling the power of the HOA, piece by piece. The months that followed the initial legal victories felt like both a relief and a never-ending battle. The court system moved slowly, but Tom's determination never wavered. The HOA, once an omnipotent force in the neighborhood, had been exposed, its corrupt dealings laid bare for the world to see. Marla Davis, the president of the HOA, found herself on the defensive, constantly attempting to shift the narrative and manipulate the media. But with the mounting legal pressure, her power was rapidly unraveling. Tom's story had become the rallying cry for others who had suffered under the same oppressive system. And with each passing day, more voices joined the fight. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to lend their testimony, and others who had felt isolated realized that they were no longer alone. What Tom had started out of necessity to protect his home had blossomed into a movement that aimed to hold the HOA accountable for its actions. The foundation of fear that had once kept the community divided had been replaced by solidarity and a shared desire for justice. The culmination of this movement came when the court date arrived. Tom had prepared himself for this day for months, knowing that it was more than just a legal proceeding. It was the final showdown. The stakes had never been higher. His legal team, strengthened by the revelations of corruption within the HOA, was ready to present the full extent of the HOA's illegal activities, including Marla's involvement with developers, the unlawful foreclosures, and the manipulation of property sales. The evidence they had gathered over the course of the investigation was overwhelming. Documents, testimonies, and a trove of internal communications from the HOA painted a damning picture of an organization built on exploitation and deceit. Tom had come a long way from the man who had once been silenced by the HOA's authority. Now, he stood at the front of a legal battle that could reshape the future of the neighborhood. His resolve was unshakable, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Marla and her allies would not go down quietly, and the outcome of the trial was uncertain. As the trial unfolded, Tom found himself surrounded by the very people who had once been his quiet neighbors. They had come to support him, to stand with him as witnesses to the abuse they had endured under the HOA's rule. There was Linda, a widow who had been fined for the slightest imperfection in her garden, never able to keep up with the endless demands placed on her by the HOA, and Greg, a former teacher who had been forced to sell his home after a series of fines for insignificant infractions piled up. They were all there, ready to testify to the ways in which the HOA had tormented them. It was a powerful reminder that Tom's fight had never been just for himself. It was for all of them, for the countless people who had been too afraid to stand up. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Marla Davis, once a figure of immense power in the community, sat in the defendant's chair, her face a mask of defiance. She was no longer the polished, authoritative leader she had once been. The evidence against her was undeniable, and her attempts to deny the charges fell flat. She had underestimated the depth of Tom's resolve, and now, in front of the court, she found herself exposed. The witnesses, including Tom, spoke with a calm determination that resonated with the jury. They described the ways in which the HOA had used its power to control every aspect of their lives, from the fines that were imposed for trivial reasons to the manipulation of property values that had led many homeowners into financial ruin. Tom's testimony was particularly powerful. He spoke not only of the satellite dish that had started the whole ordeal, but of the larger fight he had found himself in, one that was about standing up against a system that abused its power, that took advantage of people's fear and ignorance to further its own agenda. As he spoke, his voice steady but passionate, he knew that the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. Marla's defense was weak. She attempted to deflect blame onto the HOA as an institution, arguing that the actions of the individual members were not reflective of the organization as a whole. But the evidence was irrefutable. The emails, the meeting minutes, the financial transactions between the HOA and the developers, it was all laid out for the court to see. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. The case wasn't just about Tom's satellite dish anymore. It was about exposing a culture of corruption that had existed for years, unchecked and unchallenged. In the end, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with a verdict. Marla Davis was found guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, racketeering, and abuse of power. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners who had been affected by its illegal actions, and the organization was dissolved. Marla was sentenced to prison. Her once imposing influence shattered beyond repair. The community, which had been so divided by fear and manipulation, was now united in victory. Tom felt a surge of relief and vindication. He had done it. He had not only won back his own home, but had taken down an organization that had caused so much suffering for so many. The sense of justice he felt in that moment was indescribable, but it was bittersweet. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The months of stress, the sleepless nights, the toll on his health, he couldn't help but feel that the victory, though sweet, had come with a heavy price. But as Tom stood in the courthouse, surrounded by his neighbors, he realized that the battle had been worth it. The victory wasn't just his own. It was a victory for the entire community. For the first time in years, the people of the neighborhood felt a sense of ownership over their lives, a sense that they could fight back against the systems that had tried to control them. The HOA had made its last move, and it had failed. But Tom knew that this wasn't the end. The neighborhood would need time to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been broken by years of oppression. But the seeds of change had been planted, and the community would never be the same. In the days that followed the trial, Tom received messages of support from neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had followed the story. The media coverage was extensive, and the story of Tom's fight against the HOA became a symbol of perseverance, of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. Tom had become a hero in his community, but he didn't see himself that way. He was just a man who had been pushed too far, a man who had stood up for his rights and, in doing so, had sparked a larger movement. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of resistance, but that's what he had become. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt a sense of peace. The quiet life he had fought for was his again, but this time it came with a new understanding of the power of community and the importance of standing up against injustice. As the months passed, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The HOA's influence was gone, replaced by a new, more democratic form of community organization. The people of the neighborhood came together to form a new homeowners association, one that focused on collaboration, transparency, and fairness. Tom, having learned so much through his struggle, was asked to be part of the new leadership team. At first, he hesitated. He had fought so hard to free himself from the HOA's grasp that the idea of becoming involved again seemed daunting. But in the end, he realized that the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. Still more to be done to protect the community from the kind of corruption that had taken root before. And this time, Tom was determined to ensure that the people of the neighborhood had a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The battle was over, but the work had just begun. The final victory was not just in the courtroom. It was in the renewed sense of ownership, pride, and unity that emerged in the aftermath. The people of the neighborhood, once divided by fear and manipulation, were now united by a common purpose. And Tom, who had started as a man simply fighting for his own home, had become a leader in a movement that would change the community for the better. The war had been won, but the true victory lay in what came next: the rebuilding of trust, the reclaiming of power, and the restoration of freedom to a community that had been oppressed for too long.